So let's now get started with the first learning goal, which is about the main liquidity ratio. And if you remember a different, or let's say an earlier part of this course, we already talked about liquidity and what it means to be liquid and to have, let's say, liquid assets. And we said that liquidity is really related to being able, for example, to pay your bills, to pay your, let's say, trade payables in time. And so that was the definition of liquidity. We also said a liquid asset is one that is very near to cash or cash itself. And so these ratios have to do with this aspect of a company. So the first ratio that we have there is the so-called current ratio. And that is, I would say, one of the easiest ratios we can have, because it simply looks at current assets and then divides this by current liabilities. And since we dived into that quite a lot when we looked at the balance sheet, you are also very well aware and familiar with where to find these items. So current asset actually compares the current liabilities, so cash or assets that soon will be turned into cash. So for example, the receivables with the current liabilities. And so basically, and that's also what I told you the last time with some of the ratios, there are different types of businesses which require different current ratios. So not every company has the same requirements for the current ratio. So we can see manufacturing businesses normally have a high current ratio. So have, and you can see that in this part here, have a high current ratio. So this means this part up here has to be way bigger than the part down there, so the denominator. But supermarket chains normally have a low current ratio. So this basically means that if you want to compare these two types of businesses, so manufacturing and supermarkets, it doesn't really make sense. And so also when you look at real companies and when you analyze them, it doesn't really make sense to compare across different industries, because every company has, or every industry might have different requirements. Finally, the higher the current ratio, the more liquid the business is. And that's quite clear, because the higher this is, the more the nominator is compared to the denominator. And so the more, let's say, cash or liquid, or let's say the more cash or assets you have that are, let's say, could soon be turned into cash. And you need those, of course, to cover the current liabilities. So, there's, however, an exception. It says, however, a very high ratio on this indicates that excessive amounts are tied up in the cash or other liquid assets and not used productively. So this basically means that if you have a very high current ratio, it could also mean that you have a lot of, let's say, assets tied up in the business. So let's say they might have thousands or millions of euros in cash laying around. And even though it's not bad to have that, they could use this cash for different opportunities. So if you compare company A that invests this money into other projects and company B that stores all the money in the bank account, then company A uses the money more productively. And so this basically means that you should, of course, cover your current liabilities, but you should also think about how to effectively and efficiently, we learned the difference between the terms, you use the current assets in your business. And that is basically everything about the current ratio. So now that we discussed the current ratio, we're going to move on to the acid test ratio. The name sounds a bit strange or maybe a bit complicated, but it's actually basically the same ratio as the current ratio, with just one minor change. You can see the current assets are still divided by the current liabilities, but inventories are subtracted. Sometimes it's also called the quick ratio or something comparable, because basically what it does, it is let's say I said, a very similar ratio to the current ratio, but it tests liquidity in a more stringent way, in a more strict way. Because basically inventories are excluded, as many businesses cannot turn inventories into cash very quickly. And so we exclude that to actually look more closely at the liquidity. Because as we said, cash is the most liquid asset. And so therefore we exclude inventories because they are less liquid than cash. And so we have a better proof of how, let's say, liquid a company is and how easy the company can pay its liabilities. So some companies can transform its inventories to cash very quickly, for example, supermarkets. And so basically in these cases, the inventories can be included in the ratio. So you see, again, it depends on the industry. But if you are in an industry where it's difficult to turn inventories into cash, or where it's more difficult than in others, then this ratio definitely makes sense, because then we can get a better measurement of the liquidity. As with the last time, I again brought you Fontes Manufacturing Incorporated. And so here again you can find the financial statements, the financial position, the balance sheet, and also the income statement over there. And again, your task is to calculate all the liquidity ratios for both years and to interpret the results. And in order to read this better, I put it a bit, I filled the screen a bit more with this. And so again, please pause your video at this moment and calculate the current ratio and the acid test ratio. So now, after having done this, I hope that you didn't have any issues with calculating this. And I think going through this calculation here, or these calculations, will be quite easy. What I will do again is I will look at the different calculations from 2017 to 2018 and go back to the financial statements to actually show you where you can find everything. So with the current ratio and the acid test ratio, we in the nominator look at the assets, the current assets, and here at the current liabilities. And here we also, with the acid test ratio, as we just explained, also subtract the inventories. So if we go back, well, we can basically see is that here in this part, we can find the current assets. So basically, we will be able to just take the sum of this. So we have the 544, the 679 for this. And basically, we can find the current liabilities down here. And so that's where we can find all the data that we need. So if I go back to the calculation, we can see the 544, which are the current assets for 2017, divided by the 291, which are then the liabilities, gives us a 1.9 times, a result of 1.9 times for the current ratio. If we do the same thing for 2018, we can see that the ratio drops a little bit, so by 0.3 points. Times means that in this case, the current assets can cover the current liabilities 1.9 times. And so if we calculate, if we interpret that, we can see that this is a negative development because we can cover less of our current liabilities with the assets. But there's no clear indication yet if this is a matter for concern. And the acid test ratio will provide more insight, because as I told you, there's no fixed current ratio that companies need to have. And so this means it depends on the industry. And maybe they use their current assets in a very good manner. So maybe they invest their money again. And so this might lower the current ratio again, but maybe the 1.6 is still fine. Let's look at the acid test ratio. Here we simply exclude the inventory, so the 300 in this case and the 406 in this case. We see it's 0.8 and 0.6 times. So what we can see is, again, this is a negative development because our, let's say, liquid assets can cover more or less of the current liabilities. So that's, of course, an issue for the company. The liquid current assets do not cover the current liabilities in both years, so it's not at least 1.0. So there might be an issue because the company does not cover all of its liabilities, current liabilities, with the liquid current assets. And so if there might be more bills, there might be some that they couldn't pay or can't pay. So business might experience liquidity problems, as I just said, if they can't pay all their bills when they're due. And that's basically the calculation of these ratios. So if we go back or go forward to the overall conclusion, liquidity has declined from 2017 to 2018. Both ratios show a decline from 2018 to 2017 to 2018. So that is definitely something we can conclude. But especially the decline in the acid test ratio is worrying, as the business might struggle to meet short-term obligations. As I just told you, the problem is that they don't cover their current liabilities with their quick assets, their liquid current assets. And so that might be a problem if they have to pay all their liabilities, current liabilities. Also, what we can say is that the decline might have been planned by the business to support the expansion. The increase in non-current assets and the number of employees is, for example, something that we can see. So if we go back to the overview, we can see that they have more non-current assets and also more employees. So basically, in this sense, they might have planned that there is a decline in this ratio to support the growth of the company. And also, then basically we can see once the benefits of the expansion, like more non-current assets and the number of employees, comes on stream. So when the benefits of the expansion come on stream, the liquidity might improve again. Because if you expand, you might experience issues in this regard. Because if you expand, you might need more cash for that. And for example, then your current ratio or the acid test ratio could decline. But if this expansion will lead in the end to more sales in the future and then to an even better current ratio and acid test ratio, then everything is fine. So we would have to dive more into the company, talk to people, talk to the management and see, did you actually plan that? Or is that the result of certain issues and problems in the company? And then, of course, we would have to take action. And with this, basically, we finish the main liquidity ratios and can then move on to the next category.